Welcome to Down Ancient Trails, the online archaeology forum of the Sharma Center for Heritage Education, India. Brush the dust off long forgotten thoughts. Slice through time and space.
Listen to stories in stone.
Whispers of voices lost in time.
Build bridges across worlds.
Curious minds reach out to the past. And travel down ancient trails.
So hi everyone. I'm Ariel Malinsky Buller. I'm now in Germany, but before that I was in Jerusalem for more than 15 years, and I'm still in Jerusalem in my heart. As you can understand from the accent, I'm Israeli, so if my accent is not understandable or anything, just write in the chat, speak slowlier, and I will try, because when I'm excited, I'm speaking faster. And I will be excited, because I'm always excited about it. A few tiny words before. This project could not be happening without my Armenian colleague Boris Gasparian, so he's equal member, and I'm talking on behalf of the group, and of course Phil Glauberman, that is my partner. Besides that, all the things that I will show today are preliminary. What I mean preliminary is they were not published, and if you will quote me, I will refute it. So I'm half joking, half serious, so please keep it in this group, and because it's not yet published. So what I'm talking about today, I will talk about the area of Southwest Asia, that just to have a brief introduction, we have the Nile that is still in Africa, and then we have the first step out of Africa. You are already stepping into what we call the Levant. You have the two big rivers, the Mesopotamian rivers, and in the north, this is Southern Caucasus, where my ruler is, and this is the area that I'm going to talk about in this lecture mainly. But before I do it, I would like to introduce, wait a second. I would like to introduce the different categories or geographical categories that people are using in this region of Southwest Asia, because of political issues, mainly because people do not want to insult any one of the countries. So instead of saying Iraq and Iran, people are saying Zagros. Instead of getting into politics between Israel, the territories, the Palestine territories, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, you just call it Levant. And the Anatolian Plateau, people call Turkey today. And we have, of course, Arabia, that we heard yesterday from Professor Petraglia. So this is more or less the region. And as I said, its region is defined by its great biodiversity. So topographically, we have the mountain chains of the Zagros and the Anatolian Plateau, and we will talk about the Caucasian mountain range, the two mountain range. And of course, we will talk about the Levantine diversity as well. So this is more or less the diversity. And here, just to give you an example to put us in a geographical and historical context, this is the region on the right 100 years ago, 106 years ago, how it looked like without political barriers, and today. So and of course in the past we don't talk about politics. So this is why we have these categories that are cross-cutting political agendas. So just going to the geography a bit, just to understand where we are. We have the desert belt on the Saharan and Arabian desert belt, that the southern point of Israel and Jordan are part of it. This is the Negev desert. And you have the Sahara-Arabian zone on the south. Then you have the Mediterranean zone that it's defined by the rain that comes only in the winter, and as you go north, it changes, and the rain differentiate into two periods, mainly in autumn and spring, and less in the winter when it's snowing. And this more or less also dictates the type of vegetation, and it's important to our story in understanding the adaptation. And we will go a bit to details. This area is studied for the last almost 90 years, and I'm starting here from the very beginning of it, just as a more or less a cautionary note to where we are today and the way we ask our questions today. And this is really important to have this in our back of our mind. So on the right, you can see Tabun Cave, the famous cave that Dorothy Garrett excavated in 100 years almost ago, 90 years ago. And this is a picture before she started. And this is a picture 4 years later, and you have the 25-meter sequence that she exposed. And this sequence is more or less provided the framework for our research in the of the middle and the lower Paleolithic in the region since this excavation, and we are still having relationship with this fundamental excavation and the fundamental structures that it's provided us. So if you will go from the bottom, you have G, F, E, and then you have all of them. G, F, E are lower Paleolithic, and then you have the middle Paleolithic, D, F, and B. And this sequence is the most emblematic and the ones that eponymous that people are keep repeating in the literature, and I'm giving it as a more or less as a cautionary note, because in a minute I will explain why. So the human remains that Garrett found came from two layers. One is from layer C, BC, more or less. It's still debated because she was shopping in Haifa in the time that they found it. And another burial of Neanderthals that came most likely from layer B. And this finding was really astonishing for the time because the jaw has a chin and it's not Neanderthal, and it came below stratigraphically the Neanderthal, and it was opposite of anything that people thought of in Europe of that time. And I'm giving it as not as a benchmark for what we know today, but as a way that people thought about how evolution should be and what actually the finds are and how they change our interpretation. And it's important to say this was 90 years ago. And this is a closer look. You have the Neanderthal Tabun 1 that is most likely a burial that came from Tabun BC, and it's above the Tabun C, which is Homo sapiens. And this relationship is important to note that culturally, the material culture of these two specimens are very similar. So it's very hard to differentiate according to the material culture between these two species. And as a research progress, this more or less trend of finding Neanderthals on top of Homo sapiens continued. And the case of Kebara Cave, the famous cave from Kebara Cave that you have the dates on the left, 60 to 48, is another example. And if you look on the right, you see all these lenses. This is remains of hers, and this is another example from close. And in Kebara Cave, they found another burial of Neanderthal, and you can see it's called Moishale after the first excavator of the site, Moshe Stekelis. And the site of Kebara gave another example of a late Middle Paleolithic with Neanderthal. And the important thing is that from material culture and from the mode of living according to the hearth, etc., you cannot differentiate it from Middle Paleolithic sites that has other specimen or other subpopulation of hominids. And in a recent example that is continuing the excavation in the 50s by Solecki in Shanidar, you have the famous burial from Shanidar Cave, now already done in a modern way, not as in the 50s with micromorphology, etc. And you can see here the reconstruction on the right. And this is the Neanderthal range that everyone is talking about. And it's important to say that we need to remember that there is other candidates of the story that are important. So we have from the early excavation of Dorothy Garrett in Schul Cave, we have Homo sapiens burial with a grave good. You can see it on the left. This is a jaw of Dama. And you have the burial in the Kafze cave that comes with a double burial. And this is important. And just recently, the late, Professor Bar Yosef just published another paper after his death, unfortunately, of Kafze cave. And this is just to tell you that it's more than a cautionary tale. It's just to tell you that you cannot in the Levant come with a ready story where you find a lithic tool, which specimen it is. So if it's Neanderthal, Homo sapiens, and the question is if it's really vital for our behavioral interpretation to know the species and how they play about. And this is another example that gives you a much deeper time of this kind of understanding of the relationship between the different subpopulations over the last a million years. And this is a figure that came from a paper from last year, and it's based mainly on genetic study. But you can see every time that you have an arrow that goes this way, this is a possible gene flow between the different categories that people are designated Homo heidelbergensis, for example, versus Homo erectus, etc. And what you can see, for example, when you look at the end of the story, that more or less for the last 250, we are talking about one population, meta-population, with a lot of variation within it that had connection between it. And the area of connection is more or less the Levant, and this is just to have it in the background, not as a four-player in the story. From material culture point of view, as I said before, the populations, the different population had similar material culture, and they exploited very similarly the environment, as you can see it by the faunal assemblages, as well as you can see it by the raw material procurement, and I will go into it in the end. And just to give you an overview, a very short overview of where we're coming from and where I come from when I went to the Southern Caucasus, to the northern part of the Southwest Asia. This is more or less the framework that we're working in. We have the early Middle Paleolithic with Abu Zif, and you have this specific type of tools. You have Kafze cave that is later, it's MIS5, 120 to 90 more or less. And we have the late Middle Paleolithic that is more famous for its triangular Levallois point. But not only, we have a lot of variations that are happening in this time, including bladelets and other type of reduction sequence. It's very, very not homogeneous industry. And in the end, you have the transition to the Upper Paleolithic with the blade industry and a totally change in the mode of production from the Middle Paleolithic Levallois. And from a biological, and I'm keeping it very separate from the material culture, we have before the Middle Paleolithic Zutia cave. It's specimen that was defined to any kind of species that you can imagine that exist in the Middle Pleistocene, from Neanderthal to early archaic Homo sapiens to Heidelbergensis or whatever you want. It's not dated, and it's coming from the first excavation in 27, so let's put it aside. And after that we have, from MIS5, we have the Homo sapiens. Later, as I talked before, in Amud, in Kabbalah, in Tabun, we have the Neanderthal. And recently it was suggested that also in Manot, not in situ and with a lot of problem, Homo sapiens from the same time. And even more recently, we have in Mislia cave from MIS7, Homo sapiens. just to say, it's not will be really surprising that you will find even more variation and more mess in this time period, as it's really a corridor of Africa. And instead of looking at the record as a crossroad, we need to look more closely of what we have inside. And just about a word about the climate. Yes, climate is important, but when you talk about the Levant, it's not the main actor, because in the Mediterranean, the changes are not changing dramatically and do not make any kind of restriction of occupation. So more or less we have a continuous occupation in the Mediterranean. The areas that are more affected are the ones that are, or supposedly more affected, are the ones on the fringes, the desert, the semi-desert. This is the areas that should be more sensitive. And when I will talk about it in the end, about the scale, I will show you why it should be looked at it a bit differently than what we are doing usually. And just to talk about the interpretation, the changes that people are observing in the Middle Paleolithic was suggested to be an out of Africa. So every change that you have in the record, people more or less try to make it an external change that is not locally infused. So there is every time there is a pulse of out of Africa, some people relate it to climatic amelioration, for example, in the Sahara, that removes the barriers, and then new population come with new material culture. And of course, we have the out of Europe with the Neanderthals coming into play in the later part of the Middle Paleolithic. And of course, the Middle to Upper Paleolithic was always suggested to be related to an out of Africa and the beginning of Homo sapiens as we know it in our region. On the other hand, there are other camps that says more or less there is internal dynamics in the region, and the changes are changes gradually. So the same things that you will see in one phase, you will see in the other phase, and the changes are in the quantities. And between these two modes of thinking, we are playing. The contribution of this talk is mainly to the later part of the story, and I will go to the northern edge to just give you how it looks from the northern edge, and then we will reflect to the south again. Again, I'm just talking about the Levant here, and now I will move drastically 1,000 kilometers or 1,200 kilometers to the north, to the Southern Caucasus. As I said before, this is a this is an area that is, not to say politics, and you have Georgia on the north, Azerbaijan in the Caspian shore, and Armenia in here, and you have Turkey in here as well. And this is a very, very diverse area. And you can see already from the topography, you have the northern ridge that goes up to 5,000 meters above sea level. In India, it sounds normal, but in other places it's very high. And you have other mountains that are very, very high, Aragat and Ararat, that are very, very high. As always in life, it's also a matter of definition, what is the high elevation and what is low elevation. And another important thing is that there are two major sources of paleoenvironmental information, one coming from Lake Urmia for the 130,000 years, and one from Lake Van that is giving a core that gives a reconstruction of the last 600,000 years from a very long-term project that was conducted here. So going to the paleoclimatic record of Lake Van, and it's very, very different from the Levantine, or what I described before, that there is changes, but they are not major. In Lake Van, the changes between interglacial and glacial and stadial and interstadial, between the cold period and the warm period, are much more severe and much more abrupt. And the manifestation of that in the vegetations are changes between open steppe with less tree cover during the colder condition, while during interglacial there is more open steppe forest that is expanding. and you can see it in the different publication, and you can see the changes, but how these changes are translated to the carrying capacity and to the behavior of people, this is something that we need to work on, and we need an intermediate level of understanding from the site, most likely. And the most important thing about the environmental reconstruction is that they try to reduce it to a level that is more connected to the levels that we are dealing with the decision making of people and how they schedule, because they suggested that the distribution of the rainfall changed between the cold and the warm periods. So what they said that the summer droughts were much more longer during glacial periods, and the winters were longer, in the glacial periods, while the summer droughts are more frequent. And in interglacials, there was an increase in the spring and early summer precipitation. So they change, in a way, the distribution of rain throughout the year, and this is also have an effect on the vegetation that will, of course, will affect the way people change their migration routes, etc. So just to keep it in the back seat. Zooming into the area of Armenia, you have on the left the geological map, and you see here the big fault areas, and you can see on the right the geological map. So what you have in the southern part, it's Quaternary volcanism, and this is a very active area for the last 780,000 years, with a lot of activity of volcanism and a lot of landscape development that is really recent, unlike a lot of areas in the world that is more stable. Here it's very, very dynamic. And on the other side of Lake Sevan, on what you can see here in the ruler, you have a much older landscape. And it's also important to remember that this is more or less the watershed line. So if you go to the north, this is more or less an alpine meadow today, and this is semi-desert. So it has also effects on the vegetation, this geological distribution. Sorry, one second. And if we want to connect to more or less the decision making of people, you just need to go to today, when it's good condition, and we are in the best prime time of the Anthropocene, and you look at the January temperature, and they are following in a way the elevation gradients, and you can see here that they reach to up to -27 as an average. So if you were a hunter-gatherer, most likely this is a place that you will run away in the winter, while the lower elevation where it's more milder and it's closer to zero, this is the places where you're going to be in the winter, just as a thought. And of course there is a correlation with the precipitation, and there is a straight correlation between the temperatures and the precipitation. And of course it has an effect on the vegetation and the vegetation belts that we see. And I don't expect you to read, but you can see the diversity, and this is already telling you something about the very fragmentation of the landscape between the different sub-regions. And unlike these different ecological niches, the research was done in this region is mainly based in two main areas. One around the Yerevan capital of Armenia, and the other one in Imereti. This is a region that Bar Yosef and Annabel Vercoen and their group is doing in this region for the last 30 years. So in a way, what I showed you is very diverse environment, and then the archaeology is only capturing a very small fragment of it. And this is more or less dictated the way we chose the region that we wanted to work on. So we chose Calavan 2 area that is 1640 meters above sea level, and we chose the lower elevation as complementary to the high elevation. Another important thing to say is that I forgot that in Armenia, 90% of the country is above 1,000 meters. So when I'm talking about the lower elevation over here, it's 700, 900. This is more or less Jerusalem, or if you want, it's higher than Madrid, the highest capital, you know, in Europe. So it's really not as we think about it. And this is a cross section between the lower elevation on the northern side with the Azerbaijan-Armenian border to the Turkish side and Armenian border on the other side. And this is a 160 kilometer cross section, and you can see the rugged landscape, how it's looked like. And this is Lake Sevan that we show here. And you can see that this is a river, the only river that drain Lake Sevan down to the Arax, and this is go to the Kura. And this is more or less our sandbox that we are working on. And the site that we will talk about now is Kalavan 2. And the question that behind this entire project is, what is the adaptive responses to this seasonal fluctuation and the resource availability, and how they are manifested in the settlement pattern and the mobility of, in our case, the Middle Paleolithic time. And we continued the work that started by a French and Armenian team before, published in 2011, and they did 3 trenches and they published only 1, and they found Middle Paleolithic that they dated to more or less the last 20,000 years. And we came back and we said, this is something needs to be done. It needs to be excavated over more expense with more details and more environmental information. And this is why we came back in 2017. And the entire things that I'm talking about in this lecture is as an outcome of 5 seasons in Armenia. So it's very preliminary and needs to be taken as a starting point to the future rather than the end point. So Kalavan is a really interesting site, and it's currently the only open air site in the region with fauna, and it's located in the meeting point of a major river. This is the Barapat, and a small tributary that drain into the major river. And the site and the different trenches are echoing this kind of variation. We have trenches 1, 2, and 3 that are related to the meeting point of the Barapat with the Dani. Dani is this dog here. This is why it's called like that. And trench 4, it's totally different, and it's more stable part of the landscape, and it's a successive paleosoil that is devoid archaeology, unfortunately. And this is another picture, and you can see here, this is a watershed of the Barapat. It's much larger river, and this is a Dani over here. When it's meeting, it's in the end of his life, the Barapat River. And what we have is a meeting point of these 2 water bodies. So going into the stratigraphy, you can see these differences. You have flooding from the Dani as they are manifested in this gravel that comes like a big floods. And you have a floodplain that relates both to the Dani and to the Barapat that are much finer. And within these finer floodplains, you have the archaeology. In our case, it's mainly in Unit 4 and in Unit 7. And you can see the dates. The site is between 55 to 45,000 years ago. And you can see that it's really thin layers of 10 centimeters, very short occupation with relatively dense accumulation, as well as with fauna. And there is also variation on the same landscape. Interestingly, we have also things that we didn't expect to find in this very short time of or short occupation. We have pitted anvils that most likely relates to the breaking of the bones at the site. This is still work in progress. If we go to the second trench, we have the same more or less reconstruction of the environment, and I will go into details with more or less the same chronology. Because of the distances of the different trenches, that is 25, 30 meters from each other, each one of the trenches has its own stratigraphy. And I'm just giving you a brief reconstruction of how it's looked like. Of course, we are going the other way of the excavation. So we excavated from top down, but I will reconstruct it from the bottom to top. So we have the gravels on the bottom that are coming from the Dani, and then you have a floodplain where the major archaeological layer is, and you have another floodplain that cuts into it. Not a floodplain, sorry, we have a gravel that comes and cut into it. Then we have another floodplain, another gravel coming into it, and then another one and another gravel. And it's important to say that we can actually, because we excavate, we can actually see the distance or the lateral distribution of this flooding event. It's 3 meters tall, it's 3 meters of the riverbed. So it's really, really short river flooding from the mountains into the main river. And then we have the floodplains coming from the parapet most likely, and another one on the top. And here we have an archaeological layer that is a secondary deposition that is in the contact between 5 and 6. And just adding the dates, this is 54, 52, 59, more or less everything here is the same age. And we have a later occupation at 46. And as I said, this is archaeological layers are appearing in the floodplain of the two rivers. And it's important to say that you can see in the micromorph that it's not have enough stable time to develop. And as I said, the secondary deposition of the archaeological layer that is dispersed over almost 20, 30, 40 centimeters as in the contact between these two units of 5 and 6. And this is more or less a caricature of where we are. We are in an alluvial fan coming from the mountain, meeting the main river on the bottom, and the site is more or less in this junction. Although this is a very dynamic environment, you can see that we already in the field can do the refit of the artifact, even the smallest one, even if the bulb of the removal from the tool, or from the flake. So it's really, really high preservation of even the smallest artifacts. Going into the material culture, into the lithics, we have 7 raw materials at the site. Obsidian is the main one, but we have basalt, dacite, tuff, etc. that appears in very high different frequencies between the assemblages. But obsidian is the most frequent one. And interestingly, the obsidian is not local. It's coming from a different place. It's not in the watershed. It's not appearing in the watershed as pebbles. And the obsidian is highly, highly utilized. And the obsidian has, if you look above 2 centimeters, 18% of it is larger than is tools of the largest material, and it has a lot of chips that coming from, most likely, from the rejuvenation of the tools. The non-obsidian is much more diversified. We have flake, we have levallois, we have different types of things, and it's totally 2 different industries between the obsidian and the non-obsidian. And here, just a picture, you have a basalt and levallois point versus a retouch obsidian tool, and this is really small. They discarded in a very small size. And you have other material, the metamorphic, most likely the welded tuff. They are much less reduced than the obsidian. Just to give it in a different version, if we talk about the different stages of production between the acquisition of the raw material, production, usage, and then retouch, maintenance, recycle, and transformation, the obsidian, we can see only the usage and the retouch, while the non-obsidian, we have the other reduction from even the cores to the cortical pieces until the discard. So it's totally 2 different sets of decision making. And here is just a short detail, and you can see that they are trying to economize the obsidian, and they even remove the tip of a retouch point. So if you look at here, this is a retouch point, and they just removed it like a spore. And the amazing part of the site is that you can go to a technological stages that you cannot go in flint or in other material because it's so well preserved. So if we will just measure the short, what is left on the blank, and we can say that it's intermediate between what is discarded, that are usually between 2 and 2.5 centimeters, the end of the retouch points, to the starting point that it's around 6 centimeters, and in the middle. So they just remove it until the end of its life. It's really, really marvelous industry. And you can see more example of rejuvenation of the tip. You have here the previous ventral face, and you can see that they remove the tip again and again in a different ways. The interesting part is that you can actually distinguish the phases of retouch, and you can see different flakes that coming from the retouch, and you can actually reconstruct it. It's a common phenomena in the regions that you have this kind of tools, and you can just marking here the ones that are very similar to the ones that we saw in Kalavan. It's almost identical pieces that you just remove the tip in order to continue to do the retouch. Interestingly, in Yerevan, it's where the raw material is, while in Kalavan it's not, and it's a point for the future to understand. The nice thing about the obsidian is that it's all can be by the PXRF with Larry Fram. We can actually, even the chips can be reconstructed to the sources. And this is, So this is a map of the known sources, and Ellery zapped the entire material from the site, and he can actually reconstruct the different places that the material came from. And we have materials that come from 50 kilometers as a crow flies, but people are not flying yet, and not in the Middle Paleolithic at least. And then we have even sources that comes to 200, 160 kilometers to all ranges, to the north to Georgia, to a source in Georgia, and source in Turkey, and a source in South Armenia. So it's really a wide range of area that coming to the sites, and it's opening a lot of questions about it, and I will talk about it later. If we talk about the faunal assemblage, interestingly, the faunal assemblage is diverse. What I mean diverse, it's not fitting what we thought of a very short-term occupation. We have the boss bison as the most prevalent species, and then we have onager and horse. It's really interesting because onager is a really open environment, and horse is open, but onager is more drier. And we have the red deer that is more open in plains and mountains, and we have the rocky and the caprine. So this is a really interesting assemblage of species. And importantly, what we have is assemblage that is containing mainly the long bones. And here you can see the Benot, our student that will do his MA about the fauna of the site, holding a notched piece. So you can see that the bone was fragmented by the occupants of the site, and they even opened it to take the marrow. And we have the cut mark, so we can actually argue that the faunal assemblage is related to human activity, and it's important to show this connection. It's not a trivial one. Interestingly, we have a lot of environmental proxies that I will not get into in this stage, but I will just mention the microfauna because it's important for the next site that we will talk about. The microfauna is much more sensitive for smaller scale environmental reconstruction. The these species are much more flexible and they are much more migrating, while the microfauna is much more localized. And what we have is mainly species that related to steppe and grassland environment. And it's interesting because within the site we have two taphonomies. We have in trenches 1 and 3, whereas a riverine, it's more showing digestion marks and it's related to most likely to the time of occupation, while in trench 4, where it's more stable, we have they died in the burrows, and we don't really know the ages of them, and it's work in progress. We're dating them by C14, etc. I hope in the future we can see this work published and we can see the differences. Interestingly, all of them show the same variation of species. So there are Pleistocene, of course, in trench 4, but how and what is the actual age in the Pleistocene, it's not really clear yet. But what is important is they are showing this steppe and grassland environment. And if I summarize shortly the Calavan, it's a high elevation site, stratified with certain sedimental units with archaeology and with fauna and lithics, and 3 main ones that are dated to 60 to 45. There are thin layers of 10 centimeters showing high resolution chronological wise behavioral signature. We can reconstruct the mobility of the hominids by the raw material and the intensity of occupation and the distance. And we can show the differences between the obsidian that is very narrow range of topological variation, while the non-obsidian show different amplitude of variation. The faunal assemblage contain a variety of prey species representing diverse ecozones that was most likely transported into the site. And the skeleton part supports this idea of secondary butchery behavior, not the place where you actually hunted the animal, then you will find all the non-meaty parts. Here we find only the meaty parts. And as I said, there is a bit of it's not really fitting what we see from the lithics and what we see from the fauna, and it's something that we need to talk about and think about much more in detail in the future. And if we put it in a larger scale and we're zooming out, what we see in Calavan most likely is a place where people took advantage of the winter-summer migration of animals, either both of bison or the horses, etc., coming to the high elevation during summer migration and then moving down to in the winter. And this is what we think is the main category or the main decision making behind it. And in order to test it, we wanted, as Michelle Obama said, but the other way around, when they go high, we go low. So we wanted to complement ourselves and go to the paleo lake of the Ararat, what we thought is a paleo lake. And we applied for a long-term project in what we thought is a paleo lake. Since then, we didn't find the paleo lake, so we need to change the title of the project, but this is another issue. And we started the project, and I will present really briefly, I hope, the preliminary results that we have. And it's something that we already did. We finished the site a year ago, and we were supposed to come next year. So it's really a work in progress. So I'm apologizing that it's so preliminary. So this is the location of the site. We have the reason that we chose this area is 1 second ago to go back is because it's not volcanic area. It's sedimentary with caves. And we thought that it's next to the lake, so it has all the good condition for Paleolithic. And we came to this area, and we have this sedimentary rocks of limestone over here and sandstone. And within that, we found this small cave that we thought that it's a small cave. it's 5-on-4, and it's overlooking the Ararat basin that you see on the bottom. And it's important to say that the cave is not a karstic cave. It's a more or less a tectonic cave that, as you can see over here, on the right there is one side, and there is another one, and it's like a shear. And this is what created this more or less a sink area where things could accumulate. So it's not really a cave in the classic karstic meaning of it, but it's something more like a hole where things are accumulating in. And this is a map of the cave, and here we have another room that we will deal. And last year we excavated 10 square meters in the entrance, and here you can see the stratigraphy, and it's more or less a cave without a stratigraphy, because everything that we have from top to bottom is windblown, and the only thing that is not windblown is coming from the rooftop, and it's just blocks that fall into it. And I will show you in a minute the details of it. So this is when you excavate, this is what you see. You have powder more or less of the windblown material, and you see here an artifact. And if you look below these boulders that fall from the top rooftop, you have an artifact. And when you go down and you remove this slab, you have more artifacts lying around. So the falling of the roof more or less kept the site sealed and prevented it from colluvial processes to fall down from this cliff. And preliminary OSL results suggest that the entire sequence of the 2 meters is dated between 52 to 35, and I will deal with the 35 because the 35 is really intriguing. And you can see that we have Middle Paleolithic all over. We don't have any other material culture at the site, nothing Upper Paleolithic, nothing from any other period. And from the more or less 30 centimeters down until 2 meters, all what we have at the site is Middle Paleolithic, with spikes of distribution in the middle of the accumulation around a meter below surface. The lithic assemblage is very resembling very much the Calavan material. We have the obsidian that is highly retouched, and we have the local raw materials that is flint. And you can see here in the general breakdown that we have totally different thing between the obsidian and the non-obsidian. As we saw in Calavan, the tools, if you remove the smaller fraction, are in here even higher, 36%, and everything that we have at the site is more or less related to, in obsidian, relates to retouch and to the rejuvenation of the retouch. While the flint has cores, flakes, blades, levallois, it's much more diversified. So it's the same more or less story. Going again to the work of Ellery, Ellery from zapped all the material, and you can see that they use the same sources that we saw used in Calavan. The 3 main ones are the ones that we saw when we were talking in Calavan: Zechunia, Gutanasar, Hadis, Gagasar, and in here they are similarly distributed to the site. So this is 50-60 kilometers to the side, the same as we saw in Calavan, just from the other side. We have other sources that are appearing in Calavan as well. Sevkar, that is 120 kilometers as a straight line, and we have another one that is very far distance in Turkey, 180 kilometers. So they're more or less the same ranges that we saw in Calavan. As I said before, we have the differences between the obsidian that is mainly used in retouch, the flint is all the other things that is not. And if we go to the faunal assemblage, we have a small assemblage that is mainly Capra and Ovis size. We have a few boss bison, and we have other things, smaller ones like hares and foxes, etc. But this is the same mixture of animals, but much more devoted to the smaller size, not like in Calavan that we saw mainly the boss bison. But still the same guild of animals is appearing in the two sides. The important thing in Ararat 1 is that there is an amazing preservation of organic material. We have seeds and we have charcoals. That this is a work by Paloma Vidal that can actually reconstruct the environment in much more detail than we can do in anything in before. And what we have is semi-arid environment. And this is more or less what we have today in the same region, but now we can actually, we talked about the ecological niche, now we can actually show it, and we have a work in progress about the phytolate, etc., and it will be a very rich environmental record as well. As I showed in Calavan, I'm showing it again in here, the microfauna is much more sensitive to the microenvironment. In here, all the assemblage is related to owl and predatory birds that eats it and spit it. So it has digestion mark, and everything that you see in yellow are semi-arid environment. And you can see that this is what is dominating the assemblage versus what we saw in Calavan, that it's much more steppe and meadow. So we can actually finally, after 4 years on the project talking about ecological niches, we can actually show it. And interestingly, we have fish and birds that also were brought to the site by birds. So it's interesting. It's really will make a really interesting environmental reconstruction with that. And we have a student that doing his MA about it. So it's work in progress. Another surprise that we were not prepared for, we have an Ahina coprolite below the main occupation. And it's really interesting because none of the bones showed the digestion by Ahina. So it's, is it ephemeral? And if it's not, we need to work on it and to understand. Next year, when we will go into the depths of the cave, I'm suspecting that we will find more Ahina coprolite, and it will make the mode of occupation at the site much more interesting and much more intricate and complicated than we have now. So just to show briefly what we think about what we have in this site, that we have a very high potential both for behavior and environmental reconstruction. And it's going to be really an interesting site because it has such a wonderful record. Environmentally wise, I think this is mostly. And the lithic looks like a very short occupation, so we can actually do a much more refined work in the future. The fauna, the microfauna, the charcoal all suggest a semi-arid environment differing from what we know in the region. So it's really a unique place to work in because it's really complementing the other places that we worked before. And we still need to understand the sediment, the modes of sediment accumulation, what is the wind-blown, and if we have changes through times through the occupation, and how they relate to environmental reconstruction, etc. This is still work in progress. And as I said, we have evidence, for example, of burnt material, mainly from the bones, because the obsidian is very hard to discern if it's burnt or not. And we have the same with the flint. But we took a micromorph, and it's still work in progress. And with the phytolates, and it will be something that we will be able to show the impact of anthropogenic input into the sedimentation of the site. As I said, it's reflect repeated occupation of short episode, and the interesting question is about the Ahina and how it's relate. And we need to refine the chronological framework, not only on the OSL, but with more measured, like C14 on the charcoal and the bones. This is work in progress. Unfortunately, the few burnt pieces that we had are too thin to TL, but I hope in the future we can also do TL, thermoluminescence methods as well. So just going back to this cross-section and what we achieved in the last 4 years, the 2 points that we have on the map that we added to the map are Calavan 2 and Ararat 1, and they are in a way segments in the settlement pattern. They use the same sources of obsidian, so we can actually link them to the same system. And the 160 kilometers is the distance of the raw materials. This is why it's the scale here. And this is more or less the areas that they roam around, and this is the question now, can we in the future link those sites to a seasonal migrating route? Can we show that they are related to the spring, summer, autumn, something over there, to the migration of animals going into these meadows and people following them and using this resource? And the same goes to Ararat 1. Can we show or can we suspect that it's more winter site that is more taking advantage of this mild environmental where it's less freezing than in Calavan? So this is where we are, and in the future we need to have more points that adds to this kind of reconstruction and understanding these small parts. So it's also going deeper in understanding of each one of the sites and adding more pieces to this puzzle. And the 160 kilometers, I just want to refer to this as a scale when we are going to the Levantine records that I started with in the beginning of the talk. So I'm just giving Israel as a scale because this is, you know, you're coming from the known to the unknown. So Israel, from the sea to the Rift Valley, it's 70 kilometers. If you take 160, you're going from Tel Aviv to Amman to Jordan, to a totally different ecological zone. And here what you have the desert belt that I started to talk with, and between the Mediterranean and the desert, it's 50 kilometers. So when we put the 160 kilometers, it's a different scale of movement. And in the Levant, Ravid Eckstein, that I'm part of this research, so I'm using it really. Ravid showed that 90% of the 90 to 95% of the raw materials come from the daily exploitation territory. So it's coming from 2 hours walk from the site. So we can actually see the territory. So when we talk about the Armenian case studies and we talk about 160 kilometers radius, here we're talking about the 2 hours as our distance. So it's a magnitude of order of differences in the territory, exploited territory. And it's important to put it, and I give another example of Ravid's work from a mud cave, a late Middle Paleolithic site, where she had more non-local material, but still everything more or less coming from a much smaller territory than what we envision from the Caucasian case studies. And I give as example from Syria, from 3 sites that was studied by Pagli in her PhD under Boida, and she talked about much smaller territories, and you can here have the 100 kilometers, but it's, you know, if you look at the raw material, they are very, very localized. Between the 25 kilometers, it's very, very small scale territories in comparison to the territories that we see in the north. And putting it into the larger frame of MPUP as a cultural and biological relay race, that people envision the Upper Paleolithic as the last expansion of Homo sapiens into Europe. And this is one of the pictures, but here they didn't put the arrows, but usually people put it with arrows and times, and as people are migrating and they have, you know, they are doing Upper Paleolithic in the Levant, but they think that they need to go to see Rome in the Uluzian very soon. So this is one of the, you know, most likely scenarios. And I think that now we can actually, the contribution of the work in the north and in the other regions that are less explored gives us a new vision of how to approach this kind of transitions. And I'm just giving it as an example, but I'm sure that we can extend it. And this is a known site that from the Middle and Upper Paleolithic, coming from the south to Tor Faraj and Boker Tachtit, up to the northern ones in Ofthe in Georgia, from the east of Mirak to Ochigazli in the west. I'm just giving the known sites or the famous site, and you can see the distribution, and you can see the, I just gave a few examples from the Levant versus the other region, and you can see mainly the black places or the black dots on the map, and why we need much more information. But in the current state of research, I'm just putting it on, and here I'm just trying to explain this very cumbersome figure. This is south to north, so from Boker Tachtit to ofthe in the north, what we saw before, and you can see that the transition between the Middle and the Upper Paleolithic is not as smooth as it's thought. So it's not really a relay kind of race that one changed and the other one changed, and there is a lot of spatial overlap between the two. And it's, again, I'm putting away any kind of biological sense of it. And within it, I'm putting here the environmental major events, the Heinrich events, cold episodes here, and the effect of them is very different. So if you are in the north and you reduce the temperature, it will be different effects than if you are in the south, and it will have less meaningful on the scheduling of people movement. So, and if I'm just trying to kind of guess the linkages between these two regions, and if you people will move up and down according to the glacial interglacial, and I'm putting what we have here, it's even much more complicated than we thought. We have Ararat cave and we have Kalavan, and it's have kind of overlapping with a lot of upper Paleolithic industries, and it's really in the middle of the region between the ofthe that is much more older or much later older Middle Paleolithic and older Upper Paleolithic than what we have. So there is an overlap, and they use the same sources. So it's really interesting, and this is one of the things that will be an open question for the future, to understand the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition in this sense of spatial differences between the different regions. Can we see it happening differently in different regions? Can we talk about the differences between different kind of transitions of the Middle Upper Paleolithic? And just to put it in a larger scheme, can we talk about demography in this time period? Because in the Levant, this late Middle Paleolithic seems to be a very dense period, whereas a lot of sites, very dense one, and then there is a reduce of number of sites and the intensity of them in the Upper Paleolithic. How it's related to the Middle Paleolithic and the Upper Paleolithic in the north and into the east, and what is the impact of climate? This is future questions that we need to ask, and we are slowly trying to fill the gaps that we have in our knowledge in this time frame in the Southern Caucasus. So in the future, in 10, 15 years, we can actually compare between the different regions within Southwest Asia. And this is the goal for the future. So thank you very much for your listening, and this is the acknowledgements. I hope I was not too long.